So dear friends, today we have with us Mr. Tony Rennell, who is a journalist with decades of experience in various British newspapers and an author of several books, including books on the history of the Second World War, on the work of medics in the war, and on the last days of Queen Victoria. And today he will talk to us about some of the deepest secrets of Queen Victoria, and also we are asked to say a few words about the late Baroness Margaret Thatcher, just, probably not as a historian or a journalist, but rather as a person who lived through the Thatcher years and could tell us what are the attitudes of the British society towards that, because it's very difficult for us as outsiders to understand why is it such a controversial figure. So, without further ado...
Do you want me to wait or start? Or?
Well, if you have some preamble.
I have no preamble, this is all you get. Can I first say it's a great privilege to be here. My wife is with me and my son Harry. And it's very nice to be here and to see you all here as well. I don't know how good your English is and whether you are going to be able to follow everything I say. So if you have problems and you want me to go back over something, please just wave something or just interrupt or whatever. Okay? What I'm going to talk to you about today is the secret that Queen Victoria took to her grave. Queen Victoria, legendary monarch of my country, Great Britain, for 63 years. Head of an empire so large that the sun never set on it. The exalted crowned head of a nation that was the richest and most powerful of its age. She had family relations in every ruling house in Europe. She was the cousin of your last Tsar. She was grandmother of his wife, the Tsarina. But it's not her greatness I want to explore today. Instead, I want to tell you about the very personal secret of this formidable monarch, this pillar of strict morality and duty and godliness. And I want to tell you about the secret that she took to her grave 112 years ago. She was a queen, yes, but she was also a mother, a wife, a widow, and a woman. So now I want you to imagine we're going back to the last week of a bitter and cold January in 1901, and she's dead. The old queen lies dead in her bed at Osborne House, which was her holiday home on the Isle of Wight on England's southern coast. She is dressed all in white. Her lace wedding veil covers her face. Fresh flowers are strewn around the body, among them a crown of blue hyacinths placed there by Princess Beatrice, who was her favourite daughter, the one she called Baby. A shocked world is about to be told that 81-year-old Victoria, nearly blind, crippled with arthritis, and frail from years of duty and worry and widowhood, is dead after going into a sudden steep decline in her health. I wrote a book about her death to coincide with its centenary, the 100th anniversary in 2001. This is the book, and there are some copies which, if you're really, really interested, you can just take away with you at the end, but we'll discuss that later. My research for this book took me into the closely guarded royal archives, which are kept at Windsor Castle, near London. The research took me to Osborne, where I stood thoughtfully in the very room where she died, still furnished with the very furniture, the very artefacts and paintings her eyes would have seen before they closed forever. And my research took me to a remote castle in Scotland, where I stumbled on a secret about Queen Victoria, previously hidden from the world. We will come to that secret later, but for now, let us return to that deathbed scene. The Queen's final illness took everyone by surprise. Just days before, her children, grandchildren and other relations had come reluctantly to her bedside, unwilling to acknowledge that this awesome figure in their lives was actually dying. Right. Can I just explain for those who've come in that we are the death of Queen Victoria, we are in the bedchamber where her body lies, waiting to be dressed for burial. And everybody is shocked. The British nation, the Empire and the world had learned that she was ill only 2 days before she actually died. The shock was deep. They too, like her family, could not countenance a kingdom that did not have Victoria as its queen. She was in the 64th year of her reign. Only people nearing their 70s had any recollection of a time when she did not sit on the throne of England. It truly was the end of what the newspapers, their columns edged in black, proclaimed as the greatest era Britain had ever known. And now she had gone. The nation held its breath, poured out unimaginable grief, and prepared for one of the most magnificent funerals the country would ever see. Dozens of kings and princes would ride behind her coffin. 1 million people would fill the streets of London, standing 60 deep in places. Their profound silence a tribute to their unparalleled love and respect for her. But that lay many days ahead. For now, at Osborne, there were private family things to be done before the great Queen could be laid to rest. Sir James Reid, he is an important figure in our story. Sir James Reid was her doctor, a meticulous Scotsman from the hills around Aberdeen, and he had looked after her for the last 15 years of her life. Queen Victoria was not a good patient, more of a hypochondriac really. Is that a word we know? Yes, okay. Always complaining and moaning of some ailment or other. Reid, her doctor, he pampered her and humoured her. He dealt with her terrible bouts of indigestion, tried with success to get her on a sensible diet, instead of what she liked most of all, which was a dinner of hot roast beef, and then the coldest ice cream on top of it. But in the past few months, he had seen at first hand the debilitating effect on her health of her constant worry about affairs of state, particularly the mounting casualties among her soldiers fighting in South Africa. The death toll there had topped 10,000. The responsibility had brought tears to her cheeks as she and her ladies-in-waiting sat in a gloomy circle knitting socks for the troops. She had gone off her food, become frailer, tired easily. Although the court circulars, which were the reports every day of what she was doing, although they recorded healthy trips out in her horse-drawn carriage each day, the truth is that they were now a labour for her. Her ladies-in-waiting, who looked after her, never left her side, had to find ways of keeping her awake as she went on these carriage trips. Now, it would be improper for them actually to nudge the Queen and the Empress when she dropped off. So there was much rustling of their petticoats and loud coughing to try and wake her up. But now even these carriage trips had stopped, and her world narrowed to the bedroom on the first floor of Osborne House, with its splendid view across the lawns and woods to the waters of the English Channel, none of which she could any longer see because her eyes were so dim. Reid, Dr. Reid, had nursed her night and day at the end, and his was the last name to pass her lips. It wasn't Albert, as many supposed, her husband, the German Prince Albert, dead now for 40 years, whom in her uncomplicated Christian faith she knew without doubt she was about to be reunited with in heaven. Nor was her last word Bertie, her son, the portly Prince of Wales, who had been such a trial to her with all his women friends and his courtroom scandals and his gambling and his horses and his inability to focus on issues that really mattered. He was such a poor replica of his adored father. No, it was to Dr. Reid that she had turned as she lay on the little divan bed, surrounded by her weeping family. He was on his knees. Imagine this scene. She's lying there. He is on his knees. At her right-hand side, his arm underneath her, propping her up. "Sir James," she called out softly, "I think I am very ill." He whispered back to her, "Your Majesty will soon be better." And so she slipped away. The man the Queen had wanted to nurse her to the end could not be at the royal sickbed in those last hours in 1901. Years ago, she had commanded the presence of her Scottish manservant, John Bran, her best and truest friend, as she often described him. He had been her comfort in life, and he was supposed to be there to comfort her as she died. I don't know whether you've heard of John Bran. Has nobody heard of John Bran? Well, if you've not heard of him, and you clearly haven't, then let me tell you about him. He was tall and bearded, a heavy-set man who always wore a kilt, one of those Scottish funny things. Do we know about kilts?
Yes.
Kilts, okay.
Absolutely.
And he towered over the plump, tiny Queen, who was all of 1.5 metres. That was all there was of her. She was very small. He wasn't a nobleman, nothing like that. He began as a junior gamekeeper on her Scottish estate. Then he became her groom, the man who looked after her horses. He took her out riding. He was not the sort of man that a queen was expected to become her friend. But after her husband's untimely death, after Albert's death, Bran became her most trusted companion, as she described him, loyal, truthful and brave. "He is a real treasure to me," she once wrote. "In him I feel I have a good and devoted soul whose only interest is my welfare. God knows how much I want to be taken care of." And there is in all this, you see a person, not just a queen, but a person with ordinary human needs coming out. She spoke of his uprightness, his kindness, his sense of justice, his honesty, his independence, his unselfishness. Combined, she said, with a tender, warm heart, all of this made him one of the most remarkable men she had ever met, she said. So after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, the widow queen had defied the gossips and let John Bran be her protector and her friend. Though just a servant, he was outspoken and strong-minded, and he was always by her side. He was taking control, helping her onto her horse, tucking her in a rug, which when she climbed into her carriage, and he'd get cross with her, and he'd snap at her if she was difficult. "Hold your head up, woman," he was once heard to say to her, the Queen, the Empress, and he was saying, "Hold your head up," because he was trying to put her cape round her neck, and she was being difficult. Nobody ever spoke to her like that, except John Bran. As her self-appointed bodyguard, he also kept intruders away, sometimes even members of her own family, if he thought they might upset her. But by 1901, he had been dead for nearly 18 years. But he remained there in the orders that she had personally written down, but how she was to be looked after in her final illness. In 1875, she had set down in writing that her daughters and her female attendants were the only ones allowed to nurse her, apart from my faithful personal attendant, John Bran. His strength, care, and gentleness make him invaluable at all times, and especially in illness. During a previous illness, in 1871, he had been of such use and comfort in lifting and carrying her. "He knows how to suggest anything for my comfort and convenience," she said. So the Queen wishes no one, therefore, but John Brown, J. Brown, to help her female attendants in anything which may be required. Moreover, she ordered, Brown should be in the room when she lay dying, and near at hand, that he should watch over her earthly remains and place it in the coffin. She anticipated, quite correctly, opposition to this. None of her family liked John Brown, not surprisingly. The Prince of Wales, her eldest son, the man now to become king, detested Brown, this awkward and insolent Scotsman who treated him, the future king, with disdain and disrespect, refusing to acknowledge any superior except the Queen herself. Bertie would have his revenge. Soon after he became king, he had every memento of Brown he could lay his hands on, busts, paintings, photographs, systematically destroyed. For now, though, at Osborne, the prince's hands were tied by his mother's orders. She had ruled decisively against interference from anyone, even him. The wishes expressed in this memorandum, she wrote, should be strictly adhered to and in no way departed from. Her physicians, Dr. Reid, should inform the Prince of Wales of these, the Queen's wishes. These written instructions had been handed over to Dr. Reid by the Queen in February 1898. The contents and the references to Brown, strangely unaltered despite the fact that he had been dead for 16 years. Obviously, with Brown dead, Reid could not follow the letter of the law she had laid down. But as she lay dying, he had maintained its spirit with his own strong arms and comforting words, taking the place of Brown's. Now there were more instructions to follow. Just as she had left orders on how she was to be nursed at her death, she had also left clear written instructions on what was to happen to her body afterwards, and it was these that Reid now began to follow and carry out. Some of these her family knew, because they had been contained in the formal official will that they had been shown on the night of her death. Under no circumstances was her body to be embalmed, for example. There was to be no public lying in state with people coming to look at her and look at the coffin, and she was to have a military funeral as befitted the daughter of a soldier. But the rest of the instructions, the ones that were, for our purposes, the most interesting, were kept secret from the family at her specific command, hidden away from their interference. They had been written down for her chief maid and dresser, who was called Mrs. Tuck, who took Reid aside and enlisted his help. There were certain items, Reid learnt, that the Queen wanted buried with her, which she did not want her family to know about. It was late on Thursday night, 2 days after she died, and the coffin, specially built for her, arrived at Osborne House from London. It was a huge thing, heavy for such a tiny, tiny person. The next morning, while many of the family were still sleeping, the doctor began in secret the very last act he could perform for his royal mistress. As was customary at the time, for reasons of hygiene, the undertakers had sprinkled a layer of charcoal across the bottom of the coffin in order to absorb any fluids that might still be escaping from the body. On the charcoal, Reid and Mrs. Tuck arranged the mass of items the Queen had insisted were buried with her. The list of things that she wanted buried with her was immense. There was Prince Albert's dressing gown, for example. This was laid down first, alongside his cloak, a special one that had been embroidered for him by their second daughter, Princess Alice. This was a double memento of loved ones the Queen hoped to see again, because the 35-year-old princess had been the first of her children to die. Then on top of this came various shawls and handkerchiefs belonging to members of the family. Then a plaster model of Albert's hand, some framed photographs, lockets and bracelets. It's amazing there was room for the body. They were trinkets she had collected all her life, and each one had a particular memory. There was something, however small, for virtually every member of her family, every special servant, every close friend. There was even a sprig of heather from Balmoral, their home in Scotland. Mrs. Tuck had the list, and she stood there checking it off to make sure nothing had been missed, as everything was laid in the coffin alongside the body. Oh, I've made a mistake there. The body isn't in there yet. Come back to this. These things were being put in the body in the coffin before she is. Sorry, basic mistake. As he finished his task, laying the cushion lining inside the coffin on top of the Queen's mementos, Reid kept two special items back to slip in later. The coffin was now moved to one side of the room and lifted up so that it was level with the bed and level with the body on the bed. Later that morning, the king came in with his wife, now Queen Alexandra. They sat alone with the old queen, for a few minutes. Then Alexandra placed more flowers on the body and left. Outside the door, the German Kaiser, the Queen's grandson, was waiting. He had dashed from Berlin to be at the deathbed of dearest grandmamma, as he called her. With him were her second son, the Duke of Connaught, and his son, Prince Arthur. All now joined the new king in the bedroom. Inside, the king, the Kaiser, the Duke and his son stood on one side of the dead Queen's body, their hands on straps that had been put underneath it earlier. You can imagine them going underneath the body like that. On the other side, 3 workmen took up positions. 2 of the Queen's maid took her feet, and Reid, Dr. Reid that is, and Mrs. Tuck stood at her head. And then, on a command, the 11 of them picked up Queen Victoria's almost weightless body and put it gently into the waiting coffin. The king and his royal relatives left the room, and Mrs. Tuck and the other 2 women busied themselves around the coffin, arranging the dressing gown neatly, adjusting the lace and the silk veil, just busying themselves. And Reid, the doctor, now had his final duty to perform, to put in the last 2 items the Queen had requested to accompany her to the next world. Mrs. Tuck handed him the Queen's favourite photograph of John Bran, plus a lock of his hair inside a small case. The doctor wrapped the 2 precious mementos in tissue paper to stop prying eyes, particularly those of the Queen's children, from seeing what they were. Then he placed the package in her left hand, precisely as she had instructed. He picked up the flowers the Princess of Wales had left and arranged them over and around her hand as a further cover. He felt his job was done. He had made sure her last wishes were followed. He wrote in his journal, "My duties were over with the Queen after 20 years' service." The women of the royal family were waiting downstairs in the drawing room of Osborne when Reid came in and invited them to take their last look at Queen Victoria. There were tears in the bedroom, but briefly. When they had all left, only the men of the royal family remained. And with the king at the front of the group, they watched in silence as the coffin was closed on the earthly remains of Queen Victoria. The lid was screwed down. At that moment they knew for sure they would never look on her like again. But Reid also knew that his most secret mission, the one nobody was to know about, was now certain to go undetected. Because with the coffin sealed, no one could stop the Queen being buried with the controversial mementos of John Brown she had requested. Having made sure that her instructions were carried out to the letter, he knew too that she lay in her coffin wearing not 1 but 2 wedding rings. One had been put on the 3rd finger of her left hand on that happy day in February 1840 when she married Prince Albert. The other, which she wore on the third finger of her right hand, had belonged to none other than John Bran. It had been his mother's wedding ring, and he himself had worn it for a short time before giving it to the Queen, and she had worn it constantly for nearly 18 years from the day of his death in 1883. Her instruction had been that, along with several rings from her beloved husband and others from her family, it was to be on her finger when she was buried. Now, the fact that Queen Victoria was buried wearing a wedding ring given to her by a man other than her husband, by John Bran, albeit his mother's wedding ring, had never been disclosed before I revealed it in my book. That she went to her grave with his photograph and a lock of his hair in her hand was known to historians, but the gold ring, with all its symbolism and added mystery, was a revelation. We can be certain she was wearing it because it is made crystal clear in the instructions she left that this is what she wished. It was her command, indeed, and Reid followed her orders to the letter. That was the sort of man he was. If he had deviated from them in such a vital way, it is unthinkable he would not have recorded the fact somewhere in his many writings. He kept those written instructions, a dozen pages of them, and since then they have remained in the keeping of his family. They are written in the clear and unmistakable handwriting of Harriet Phipps, the Queen's secretary and lady-in-waiting, who had copied out the words dictated to her by the Queen. The Queen's authentication was on the envelope. Her spidery handwriting sprawled and scrawled across the vellum, almost undecipherable, but you can just make out it says, "Instructions for my dressers to be opened directly after my death." And she listed in precise detail the many rings she wanted on her fingers in death, from her husband, her daughters, her mother. And there, leaping off the page more than 100 years later, were the electrifying words, "A plain gold wedding ring that had belonged to the mother of my dear valued servant, J. Brown." Why had no one come across this little gem of information before? Well, thereby hangs another tale. After her death and funeral, the Queen's instructions had been kept by Dr. Reid and handed down to his heirs, along with all the other papers he had gathered in a distinguished public life. They passed eventually into the possession of his grandson, Sir Alexander Reid, known as Sandy. Now, Sandy's wife, Michaela, are we getting confused? Are we all right? Sandy's wife, Michaela, used this archive to write in 1987 a biography of Sir James Reid, and a most excellent biography it is too. Entitled Ask Sir James, it was an important source for this book, Last Days of Glory, my book on Queen Victoria's death. After I'd finished the first draft of the manuscript, I wrote to Michaela Reid to ask permission to quote from her book. I also wondered if we, that's Sarah, my wife, and I, might call in at the Reid's magnificent home just outside Jedburgh in Scotland. They were happy to meet us, so we duly arrived at their home. A castle, in fact, though quite a small one. And we were left for as long as we liked to look through Dr. Reid's papers. There were just lots and lots of files, and we could take and look at anything we liked. It was one of those moments that historians treasure when you actually have real documents with the history is just oozing out of them. And yeah, there were dozens of files and documents galore, including that original secret note of instruction that Victoria had left about her burial arrangements. It was eagle-eyed Sarah who noticed the reference to John Brown's ring and quietly nudged me about its significance. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do about that? There had been no mention of this in Michaela Reid's book, but here it was, spelt out as clear as a bell. Victoria wanted to be buried with the gold wedding ring given to her by her servant. What to do? Should I just note down the words, say no more, and slip away and use it? It was tempting, because I'm a journalist and we do things like that. But that would have been dishonourable. I'm also an author. So I asked Michaela about the reference, and the story she had to tell about this was a fascinating one in itself. A lesson in how powerful people feel the need to try to hang on to information and deny it to others, a situation you may well be familiar with. She told me that after writing her biography of Sir James, she had submitted the manuscript to the Royal Archive for approval, which was necessary since she had quoted other royal documents in her book. Now, the people in the official Royal Archive, as I know from my own experience, see themselves as the guardians of the reputation of the royal family. They are sensitive and eagle-eyed, and when they spotted her reference to John Brown's ring, they demanded she remove it from her book. Not wanting to upset them, fearing they might veto the entire book, she did. So I asked her, would she mind if I used it in my book? And she shrugged. And she didn't say yes, and she didn't say no. Instead, she told me a story of how she and her husband had once been at a weekend party with Princess Margaret. I don't know whether that is familiar. Princess Margaret is the present Queen's sister. She's now dead. She was quite a fearsome woman, Princess Margaret. Anyhow, when they went to this dinner party, the Princess Margaret was there, and she was cross. She went straight up to the Reids and she said, "You've got something of ours and we want it back." And that something was the document detailing Queen Victoria's secret wishes about what was to go in her coffin. The royal family knew the Reids had it. They'd always known, and it had always rankled and annoyed them. They hated family stuff being in someone else's hands beyond their control. "Give it back," the princess said. "Give it back, we want it." The Reids, to their credit, refused to part with it, and were rather cross themselves at the princess's high-handed demand. So they had shown it to me, without comment or consent, to use as I saw fit. Well, what do you think I did? Well, my own book had already gone to the Royal Archives for a similar vetting. That had been a condition for me having access to the archives at Windsor Castle for some of my research, and they had by now approved my manuscript. So I simply inserted the material about John Brown's ring in the final manuscript of the book, and somehow never quite got round to resubmit it for them to look at. I got away with it. There was no comeback. I wasn't arrested or charged with treason. I'm here to tell the story. That Queen Victoria was buried with John Brown's ring on her finger became a published and an established fact. But what did this fact actually mean? It did not signify, of this I am certain, that Queen Victoria and her servant John Brown secretly were man and wife, a claim that was common gossip in the middle of her reign, and which has never totally gone away. Rumours that there had been such a wedding began in 1866, after Bran extended his duties at Balmoral in Scotland to the other royal homes at Osborne and Windsor and Buckingham Palace and so on, and in effect became the servant constantly by her side. The name Mrs. Brown was first whispered behind gloved hands in smart London drawing rooms. Then the more daring magazines turned the relationship into satire. Mrs. Brown, they would say, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Brown. The foreign press, unrestrained then as now by fears of libel or lèse-majesté when it comes to the British royal family, went further. The foreign press insisted that a marriage had actually taken place. It wasn't true, but the Queen's behaviour had made it open season for the gossip mongers. This was the low point in her popularity, and still mourning Albert 5 years after his death, warning him to the extent that she still had every morning in his bedroom in Windsor Castle, she had his shaving mug put out with hot water in it every day. The servants had to put it there. All his shaving, his razor and his shaving mug and everything, his soap, everything was put out from every day, and the servants took it away at the end of the day. But she insisted it was done. She refused almost to acknowledge that he was dead. And in this rather extreme widowhood, she shut herself away from all her subjects. She was an absentee monarch. She chose not to be seen in public. It was hardly surprising if, therefore, some people let their imaginations run free over what was really going on behind closed doors in the royal palaces. Now, you will appreciate it is impossible to prove that an event, particularly one alleged to be a secret, did not take place. But there is no trace at all, not the slightest hint of a marriage. Sir Frederick Ponsonby, who was the Queen's deputy private secretary and a leading figure in the royal household, talked to a number of people who might have been in on such secrets, including a duchess who was said by the gossips to have been present at the ceremony, to have been present at the wedding. They all laughed at the idea, he says in his memoirs. Moreover, everything we know about Victoria argues against her marriage. To her, Prince Albert was irreplaceable. But if he were to be replaced, to do so with a man of Brown's position in life, a groom, a servant, was simply unthinkable. The Queen strongly disapproved of people who married beneath their station, from a different class. She once said, "How could that woman accept him? How that woman could accept him, I cannot understand." That was her damning verdict on one of her high-born ladies who wanted to marry a mere doctor. So the idea of a groom was just out of the question. We can take it then that Victoria was never John Brown's wife. Or was she his mistress? Did she take this man whose craggy looks and strong arms clearly pleased her, not just into her household, but into her bed? The idea is an attractive one. Catching out Queen Victoria, that symbol of prim, Puritan moralising, actually dealing in extramarital sex, is delicious in its irony. If it were true, but the evidence sadly is against it. It is true, and surprising to many people, that she was a passionate woman. She had a fulfilling sex life with Albert. She described her wedding night with him as bliss beyond belief. 17 years later, when the birth of her 9th child led to her doctors warning her against getting pregnant again, she asked plaintively, "Can I have no more fun in bed?" There was a lustiness about Queen Victoria that belies the image that has come down to us. But with Albert's death, she would have buried those feelings in the depths of her grief. There are two compelling reasons for this conclusion. First, it was God's will that Albert had died, and he had always pressed on her the need to submit herself to divine providence. It followed, therefore, that it was God's will that she should bear the consequences of his death, a celibate widowhood, however much she hated sleeping alone, and however much she missed his presence. Secondly, she had a simple Christian faith. She believed in heaven. She knew she would see her husband Albert again. They would be reunited, and she would have to answer to him as well as to God on the other side. So how was she possibly going to explain away an earthly affair with another man? And not just any man, but John Brown, a servant. That thought alone, of Albert the Good as he was known, hurt and betrayed, questioning what she had done, moaning at her for the rest of eternity, that would have been enough to stop her carrying on with John Brown, even if the idea ever crossed her mind. What then was her relationship with him? She spoke of him always as her truest friend. She trusted him. She liked having him around. Most of the people she met shrank from her because she was their queen. Even her eldest son was terrified of her. As a grown man, If he was late for dinner, he would skulk behind a pillar, wiping the nervous sweat from his cheeks and plucking up the courage to go in and face her cold stare. Brown did not shrink. He handled her, not just in the sense of ordering her day-to-day life, but physically too. She liked his arms around her. She liked the comfort of being picked up by him and settled into her carriage or her chair, a rug wrapped tightly around her. Comfort is a word she used often about him, and comfort is what he was to her. Others were sure the comfort went further. Courtiers and servants noticed little incidents and gossiped about them to their families. He was seen coming out of her bedroom, a place where even her grown-up daughters rarely went, if ever. He treated her with a familiarity that suggested a greater intimacy, but whether any of this amounted to a physical affair seems to me extremely unlikely. Apart from the dread of having to account for herself in the hereafter, two things would have deterred the Queen: the fear of conception and the fear of discovery. At the height of the Mrs. Bran allegations, she was in her late 40s. Pregnancy would have been highly unlikely, but not impossible. She had conceived easily enough before. She had 9 children in 17 years. It could just happen again. It is a risk she would not have taken. As for discovery, well, there was little that went on in the royal palaces that went unnoticed. There was always someone around, someone watching, someone behind a pillar. Before she embarked on an intimate relationship with Brown, the Queen would have had to be certain she could do so without being detected. And a second's thought would have led her to conclude that this would be next to impossible. Moreover, if she had something to hide about her relationship with John Brown, it was odd that she went to such huge lengths to fight his corner. She went into battle against anyone in her entourage who tried to curb his position and privileges, despite the fact that in doing so she drew even more attention to him. She insisted that Brown should have a special place in her carriage. After his death, she could see no reason not to write and publish a memoir of his life for all to see. These were not the actions of a woman with a guilty secret. It was others who were uncomfortable about John Brown, others who saw smoke and assumed there was fire. She saw her relationship with her servant as wholesome and above board. Now, the wedding ring the Queen received from John Brown, is intriguing. It shows just how close he was to her heart and she to his. We can imagine the scene. His mother had given him her wedding ring in 1875. He had worn it himself for a while, then handed it over to the only woman he loved, the only other woman he loved apart from his mother, the Queen. She accepted it. Whether she wore it in his lifetime is not clear, but when he died suddenly in 1883, she put it on, and as her written instructions declare, wore it constantly from that day on without anyone around her knowing. Clearly she valued it enough to order that it should remain on her finger in death, alongside rings from her husband, from her mother and from her children, because Brown was as dear to her as they were. But the fact that she could mention it only in her most secret instructions, that those that even her family were not allowed to see, also tells us something. She knew the animosity it would provoke. She knew how easily her wishes, just like her devotion to John Brown and his to her, would be misunderstood. But ultimately, we will never know the truth. The mystery of the precise relationship between Queen Victoria and John Brown remains just that, a mystery which back in 1901 she took to her grave. And those, of course, are always the best mysteries of all. Queen Victoria's funeral was a massive, massive state occasion. As I've said, millions of people filled the streets of London, standing in silence, many of them weeping. But most of all, they were stunned, unable to take in this momentous death, that this momentous life of a great queen was actually over. 6 weeks ago, another of Britain's great women died. Not a queen, though she sometimes acted in a queenly way. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister for 13 years. You thought I couldn't get from Victoria. That's it. Now, she and Queen Victoria had much in common, surprisingly. They both had a strict and unswerving moral code. Both believed in the greatness of the country they served. During their reigns, I think we can use the word reign about Mrs. Thatcher, Britain was transformed into a different country. The Mrs. Thatcher's funeral was a much more muted affair than Queen Victoria's. There was respect for Mrs. Thatcher, but there was also loathing. There wasn't much love for her. She wasn't very lovable. The people hadn't taken her to their hearts as they had Victoria. And she had been out of political power for a long time, 22 years, 22 long years, during which she had been an unhappy presence, brooding from the sidelines as the world moved on. In that time, people forgot, as people always forget, what she had achieved. And they forgot for the simple reason that the changes she had achieved in society were now so firmly entrenched that people could not remember how awful life was before she became Prime Minister in 1979. Before 1979, Britain was a country in severe decline. Our industries were old-fashioned and ruled over by trade unions, whose power seemed unstoppable. They forced up the cost of making cars, for example, to the point where we could not compete in world markets. Britain was going downhill, slowly, bit by bit, becoming a third-rate, irrelevant nation, living in the past with no future. Mrs. Thatcher led the fight back. She led a battle against trade union power. She challenged them. She defeated them. British industry was liberated from a force that was holding it back. It had a new lease of life. Before 1979, too, Britain was a very bureaucratic country. The state was very powerful, not as oppressive as in the Soviet Union, of course, but enough to stifle individual enterprise and initiative and self-respect. This attitude was a hangover from the Second World War, when Britain became, by necessity, a very centralised country. It needed to be to fight a bitter war and to survive. The centre commanded everything. Everything was directed towards the needs of the state. And afterwards, after the war, after 1945, that belief in socialism, in the collective, still remained at the heart of British government, even under a succession of Conservative governments. Britain became a top-heavy, top-down economy and society in which individuals could hand over all responsibility to the state. In the end, this was suffocating, stifling, negative nonsense. The real world, in the United States, in Germany, in Japan, the dynamic world, you might say, was passing us by. Mrs. Thatcher began the changes that brought life back into the British economy. She curbed the power of the trade unions, as I've said. She made it easier for people to buy and own their own homes. She reduced the amount of bureaucracy. She encouraged people to better themselves. She encouraged private enterprise. She promoted capitalism as a system to be proud of, not ashamed of. She promoted a home-owning democracy in which people had a real stake in their futures. In all this, there were inevitably casualties. Jobs were lost in industries that were no longer profitable, coal mining, for example. Parts of Britain, particularly in the north of England and in Scotland, where many of the old and dying industries had been based, suffered quite badly. Unemployment was high. People lived drab lives on state handouts. But elsewhere, Britain began to boom. New industries developed, often smaller than the old ones, but but leaner, hungrier, more efficient, more profitable. More importantly, there was a sense that individuals could succeed, that intelligence, hard work and motivation would bring rewards. This was the switch that Mrs. Thatcher flicked in Britain, like turning on a light. What you have to remember is that Britain is a tiny island, a tiny offshore island on the edge of Europe, insignificant almost. In Queen Victoria's time, it reached its height as a great world empire, stretching across the globe. We as a nation, we British, we've been on the slide ever since 1901. The key to understanding Britain in the past century is how we have managed that decline. Always overshadowed by the United States, by the Soviet Union, by Germany, now by China, but always managing to stay up there with the big boys, with a role to play, punching above our weight, yes, but still punching. Mrs. Thatcher, to continue the boxing metaphor, kept us in the ring. She kept us in the contest. That was her greatness. That was what history will remember her for. She was a latter-day Queen Victoria, perhaps. Thank you.
I hope you have questions.
I hope I have answers.
You can ask whatever you want.
Anything, anything.
About journalism in Britain, about Second World War history, and of
Anything.
course the leaders who are the subjects of today's presentation. I have
You would.
not so much question as an idea. I think that the argument about Queen Victoria being skeptical about people marrying beneath their status and disapproving of that and so on, it does not necessarily hold up as an argument for her not dallying with John Brown, because people so often have double standards and judge themselves differently from the others, especially if you are a monarch.
And Queen Victoria always had inclination to be close to people who are beneath herself, like the governess or this Indian servant.
Yeah, could you say a couple of words about the Munshi? Because I think this is an interesting parallel to John Brown.
I mean, yes. I mean, she had very, very close servants, and they were often not the people that you thought she might be drawn to. You know, one was an Indian servant, John Brown was a Scottish servant, but they were servants. She trusted them, I think, in a way, because they were totally devoted to her. But I don't think there's any suggestion of any sexual relationship. That is where I draw a line. I mean, I don't know what the Tsars were up to. Maybe the same things happened there, but I cannot imagine somebody from that rank, we're talking about a similar time, would have been having, would have married, had gone to some. This is the idea of the secret marriage, which I think is wrong, and I actually don't think most people believe that to be the case. There was. I don't know whether people here know of the film Mrs. Bran.
Somehow, yeah. We saw it.
With Judi Dench and Billy Connolly. And I think even the film, and we're talking total fiction here, pulled back from even that full suggestion. But the whole point is we just don't know. But then history is full of don't knows. I could construct the opposite argument to say that maybe something was good, but I actually believe this to be the case. And I think the religious thing is the important thing. She genuinely believed, she had the simplest religious faith. She didn't go in for lots of religious theory, but she believed in the afterlife. And she knew Albert was going to be there. Prince Albert, her beloved Albert, was going to be there. She couldn't keep any. The idea is preposterous that she should arrive in heaven This is what we're talking about. And Albert is standing there saying, is this true about you and John Bran? And what was she going to do? Where do you go? Where do you go? Where do you hide? Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. And not just for the first meeting, forever, eternity.
I have a question. Why Margaret Thatcher was so much hated by the majority of British people?
Well, she was a woman. That's one reason.
Victoria wasn't hated.
No. She was a woman who'd been elected. That was the mistake. I mean, Queen Victoria became queen. It wasn't her fault. But Margaret Thatcher had the audacity as a woman to think that she could take on men in a man's world. I think that is very, very important. She was hated because she was certain. She did not suffer doubt, at least not in public. I mean, if you read her memoirs, if you look at her diaries, there was a certain amount of doubt. She would think through a subject. But once she'd made up her mind, that was what she did. And she followed it through. Lots of politicians, they think this, they think that, they see what somebody else is thinking. They do, politics is about finding out who's on your side. Can you get this through? She didn't worry about that. Not after she'd been in power for about 2 years. She was a bit uncertain when she began, but she quickly realised that power is in doing things and in telling people what you want done and bringing them along with you. And if they didn't want to come, to hell with them. And she got rid of the people around her who were trying to undermine her. And there were an awful lot of members of the Conservative government, most of them men, who spent a lot of time trying to undermine her and thinking that she wasn't up to it. And the other thing about Margaret Thatcher was that it wasn't just that she was a woman. She was a woman from the middle classes, the lower middle classes. Now these class things are very important in Britain. The upper classes, and it's not the way it used to be, but there are still people who think they are entitled to be the ruling class. They look down on Mrs. Thatcher because she came from a very humble background. And they couldn't quite believe that she was trying to be their equal. A lot of the men in her cabinet felt them far superior to her. They felt themselves above her. And as a result, they didn't really see what she was doing. And she got rid of the difficult ones. Just got rid of them. In her time. But that is the sort of personality that it brings you disciples, but it also brings you people who hate you. And the third reason she was hated was because the things that she did that I have described there to transform Britain, there were casualties. There were trade unions, there were industries that were never the same again, and they were old industries, they were dying on their feet, but the trade unions had got together to protect these industries, to protect jobs, which we couldn't afford anymore. So you've got lots of reasons why she was hated. A woman who got above herself, can't have that. And she made, there were casualties from her policies. There were parts of the country which did suffer. That is undoubtedly true. But also there were parts of the country that got up and got on with things and did things differently as a result. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Is it still noticeable in the north, in Newcastle and around, this hard legacy, the casualties of Thatcher's years? Or did it turn around somehow?
I think all those places are better than they were. But they will... I mean, the trouble is that people get caught up in some sentimental view that unless you... the thing that always intrigues me is coal mining. I mean, coal mining is a horrible thing to do. Who would want to be a coal miner? You spend your life down there in the dark, going blind with full... And I always understood that every coal miner's one wish was that his sons wouldn't go down the pit. So when Mrs. Thatcher made that possible, they resented her for it. They never understood it.
But in spite of this hate, she was elected for for so many times, and she was the prime minister for so many years. Why?
Because I think there was a core of support for her from people like her, aspirational people, middle class people, who wanted their own homes, who believed in the things that she believed in. There were more people who benefited from what happened than there were who suffered as a result. And their suffering was mitigated by certain things, by reasonable social benefits, the encouragement to move, new industries coming in. I mean, it wasn't just they weren't just left as dead areas. There was a lot of support there. That's the answer. I mean, why 3 times? Why 3 times? I mean, one of the reasons was the Falklands War. You know about the Falklands War. I mean, I think that came along to lift her reputation as a great leader, because we won insofar as any war is won. We won, we hung on to the Falklands Islands. And she had done something that people didn't think was you could possibly do. You're going to go, from Britain up there all the way down there, and you're going to rescue islands that none of us had ever heard of. We didn't even know where they were or what they were or who was there. But they were British, they wanted a statement. If the people of the Falklands had said, we don't want you, we're happy to be Argentinian, then we wouldn't have done anything. Britain wouldn't have done anything, I don't believe. But they didn't want to be Argentinian, they wanted to be British, they were British stock, they wanted to remain British. And she said, right, we're going down there, we're going to get that. And we're going to kick the Argentinians out. At the time, I remember being open-mouthed in amazement. I thought it was impossible. I'm a coward. I would have said, you have them, we don't want those islands. But she said, no, we're going down there to get them. And it was a very, very close call. And I don't know whether people realise how very, very nearly we lost that war. And that would have been humiliation. That would have finished her. She lost the war, she would have had to resign. But she stuck to it through and through. And she came back, and that meant she was re-elected the next time. So that explains the second re-election. And the third one, I just think it was the whole...
It's a miracle.
No, it wasn't a miracle. I mean, I think the country was behind her.
Well, the economy was in a good shape,
Yeah,
I think.
that's true. The economy was in a good shape. And people could see a better future than they had before. But, I mean, she was never voted out of office. It was her own, the men in her own cabinet, basically, who got rid of her. Stabbed her in the back. And her husband, dear Dennis, who persuaded her that it was all over and that she should go. And I think she resented the men, and possibly even her husband, ever after for not standing her ground. She went far too easily.
More questions? Jeanne?
Excuse me, is it true that she had got an idea that England shouldn't produce anything, that it should be just a place for world trade and no industry there should be?
I don't think that's strictly true. I think, if anything, she was on the edge of seeing that industry was changing. We couldn't afford big industry. Coal mining, we couldn't dig coal profitably. Polish coal was a quarter of the price. The steel industry, we did not have a huge steel industry. It was uneconomical for us to have a big steel industry. So it was the big industries that were no longer profitable that she was quite happy to see go. And I think that was sensible in a small island. Other people were producing things more cheaply, other parts of the world. But what she saw was the possibility of smaller industries, more modern industries, of banking, that there were more ways of making a living in the world than just making things. But I don't think she had an ideological objection to industry. I think she thought other people were doing it better, so why compete with them? Compete with them on the things that we could do better, and that's the way she saw the future.
More questions?
If I can go back to Queen Victoria, I was just wondering, since you've obviously researched John Brown, how did he become a Queen's intimate servant? How did he go? Yeah, how did he go from a Scottish person?
Well, he was always a Scottish person in a kilt. The royal family had a home in Scotland, Balmoral, and he worked on the estate there. And that's all he was to begin with. He was a groom. He looked after the horses.
I think he was on very good terms with Albert.
He was on good terms with Albert. He was Albert's groom before he was. That's another reason she wasn't going to, have that conversation with Albert in heaven, because he had been. John Bran had been Albert's groom as well. I mean, can you imagine? Oh no, I can't even think about it. So, I mean, he was part of the Balmoral entourage, family almost, and I think that it just developed from there.
He would help her on her horse.
That's right. He would help her onto her horse. So, there was a bit of physical contact there. Not many people touched Queen Victoria, apart from the fact that she was very small. Not many of them actually were allowed to get anywhere near her. Her own doctor, Dr. Reid, didn't see her naked until after she was dead. And I remember talking to his family and saying, how could he have treated her? And he would have a meeting with her, and there was no take your clothes off and nothing like that. She would describe her symptoms, and he would say, well, perhaps she needs this potion or that potion or whatever.
The typical Victorian times, or was it gone to extreme? This contact between the physician and the patient.
I don't know.
I mean, in France they invented the stethoscope, so they had the means of examining the patients.
Yeah, but I think it was extreme in her case.
Do
You don't touch a queen.
to be undressed to use the stethoscope?
Better should.
I mean, I find it must have been very difficult for him as a doctor, because also she wouldn't follow any of his instructions. I mean, she would gorge herself with food. He put her on a diet once. He put her on something called Benja's. It was some horrible oatmeal thing that she was to eat. And she said, yes, Dr. Reid, of course I would eat that. And then she ate that. And then she had a proper meal. And who was going to say she's Queen? She's Queen Victoria. Don't do that. The only person who could say it would seem, was John Reid.
Sounds like I don't know, medieval times, the medieval medicine. What you're describing, rather than the 19th century, almost the 20th century medicine.
Well, I mean, how advanced was medicine at that point? I mean, we're talking pre. She had chloroform. Yeah, that's true.
Chloroform, right?
She did use chloroform. She did use chloroform. She was, I mean.
She used it during labour.
She used it during labour, and there was a lot of women wouldn't have it. And the church said that chloroform was to do with the devil, because women. It always comes back. Women have to suffer. Yeah, that's what the church says. So chloroform was therefore a tool of the devil. You have to suffer. But Queen Victoria took chloroform. Well, she'd been through it a lot.
If you read Tolstoy, in his later work, he has some very bitter words about physicians who undress women, and this is, from Tolstoy's point of view at that moment, this is basically the only goal in their lives, to ogle undressed patients, female patients. And it's kind of obvious that this is a rather new thing. That
you take your, yes, yeah, I suspect you're right, yeah.
He rejects it because it's a novelty, because obviously a generation before him it wasn't like that.
There were a lot of clothes to take off as well. I mean, each examination would take an hour.
That's true.
More questions?
Yes, please.
About Queen Victoria, why all people, including her family, her closest relatives, were so much afraid of her, to touch her, she was their mother, but why there was such a great distance?
I suspect mothers generally were not quite as maternal then as they are now. I suspect that's part of it. But also, I mean, she was queen from the age of, what was it, 20? 18. She was like a statue, you know, she had been there forever. Why were they afraid of her? Because I think she was quite fierce. I mean, it's difficult to know. It's an interesting point about whether Queen Victoria ever smiled, because you'll never see a photograph, and actually I've got one in there I think, but you rarely see a photograph of Queen Victoria smiling. Now partly I think that's because there aren't that many photographs, because photography was an infant in its infancy. But also, you had to sit still for a photograph for quite a long time, and it's hard to do that for, you know, the count of however much. So that's why nobody smiled in photographs in those days. Sorry?
And culturally, nannies and what have you at that time. Lots of mothers to look after their children.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, lots of mothers didn't look after their children in those days, and she had responsibilities of state. She had, you know, lots of other things to do, and she had 9 of them. I mean, that's a lot of kids.
She was a working mother.
She was a working mother. Thank you, Sarah. I don't think she was warm. She moved from being. I think she was as a young mother. There's a wonderful portrait of her by Winterhalter, of her with the family, and she's got about 4 or 5 children. It's wonderful. It's brimming with youth and happiness. Did you know that? You may know the picture.
Yes.
And then the death of Albert was an awful blow to her, and she was still, you know, reasonably young at that point, and she went into this terrible widowhood, which made her again even more untouchable. Took a lot of that warmth again. Took a lot of that warmth away from her, and so by the time we're talking about here, towards the end of her reign, you know, she's an iconic figure. She's not even very real, and I think, as I said there, I mean, her son, who became king, was terrified of her. I mean, he wasn't terrified of anybody, and he was up to the most scandalous things, but he was terrified of her, absolutely terrified. What she was going to say, I don't know, but I think she was. We've all known these people in our lives that just one look and you think, you know, haven't we?
She also hated babies.
I don't think that's true.
Or she wrote to her daughter about it, and actually she put it down into her diaries that later on children are okay, but babies are really disgusting.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, but then it's even more interesting that Bran wasn't terrified of her.
No.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. And why? How could he? Sorry, how could he
Be not so terrified.
Well, do you know what? He didn't care.
Brave.
Oh yeah, because
He didn't care.
Everybody did.
What could she do to hurt him? Nothing. And he obviously was quite an extraordinary man. And also, I wonder, in Scotland, there's quite a very sort of different social community in Scotland, and sometimes the gamekeeper, the person who runs the estate, is can say more to the Lord than anybody else can. He can be treated as an equal. There is that part of those big estates where that can happen. And I mean, I think your question is a very good one. And there must have come a moment when he said to himself, I'm going to tell her, I'm going to say it, I'm going to say what I think. And he said it, and he didn't get the reaction. He didn't have his head cut off, so there you are.
But you're saying that a gamekeeper can be on equal terms with a master, but not in England.
It's less so, I think. I mean, these are very fine distinctions. I think Scotland is the estates are bigger. Whether it's that, I don't know. There's a sense. But then again, there was Lady Chatterley, but that's another story entirely, and the gamekeeper.
Yeah. Another question. You mentioned that Queen Victoria asked when the doctors recommended that she not have more children, and she asked, "Can I have fun in bed?" Is it known what they said?
No. At least it's not known. What would you say?
Record that in your diary that
Sorry?
she asked this question. How is this question now?
From the doctors.
From the doctor.
From the doctor.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's elsewhere as well. I
Well
think.
done.
Yeah.
Because obviously by the time the
Some
doctor
ideas
should
of
have known
contraception
something.
were
Yeah.
known. It's again in Anna Karenina in Tolstoy. There is a dialogue, a very oblique dialogue between two of them, Anna and her sister-in-law, and it's obvious that Anna knows about contraception.
And she hints that you don't really have to have all the babies, but she doesn't say how.
I'm not sure who would have been brave enough to suggest that to Queen Victoria.
To Albert.
Or to Albert.
Especially to
Albert the Good, remember.
Probably should be practical about it.
And, you know, God's will. We are talking here about, you know, attitudes verging on Catholicism. You're talking about... Albert was very firm on God's will. I mean, 9 kids, there's got to be... That's a lot. Even for those days, it was quite a lot.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yes.
I've got a question. And if Queen Victoria didn't want everyone to know the secret about the ring and about the papers, how did you explain to yourself? Why can you now reveal this secret to all of us? Do you understand the question?
Not quite.
Not quite understand.
I do.
think
Yeah,
that
I do.
Is it the
Victoria-
technical part or the moral part?
It's the moral part.
Oh, the moral.
Sorry.
The moral part.
Were you wrong?
Some
Did you have a moral problem in revealing the secret that Victoria wanted to keep?
No. Did I have a problem with revealing it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because as I understood from the whole lecture, the Queen Victoria didn't want her family to know about the ring, and
Yes.
maybe she didn't want
Anyone to know.
anyone to know about
She's
it.
been dead a long time, I think, you know.
Yes, she's been dead, but it's what it was.
But that's what history does. I mean, you tease things out like that, and it gives you. I think you should ask is, does it matter? Is it important? Does it tell us anything?
With moral problems as a historian?
Yes, but I don't think that is one. That doesn't worry me. It's a long time ago, and there's nobody to be hurt by it.
It's I see it. I mean, if you were speaking about an Egyptian queen, an ancient Egyptian queen, would you raise the same issue? Probably not. How long does it take before it stops to be a moral issue? So everybody has to draw a line somewhere.
The history would be very different if it would meet all the desires and demands of dead kings and queens.
Quite boring.
Yes, yes. I think it gives a new dimension to her. I think it makes her more of a person. And so much of Queen Victoria has been myth and
And besides,
iconic rather than real.
I mean, we're not uncovering any dirty secrets here. She kept it secret from her family because they disapproved of a friendship, basically, what Tony is saying here. So,
But we can see this friendship as something very noble and actually flattering to Queen Victoria, her being capable of such friendship.
I mean, another reason for revealing it is because clearly the present royal family don't want it to be revealed. And that, I think, is probably the best reason of all. I'm a great supporter of the royal family, but I don't think that they should be able to control things that happened 100 years ago. But what other secrets have they got? And how are we going to find out? That's the next one.
So you said that she kept the Albert's ring on the engagement
On her, yeah,
And the John Brown's
On the
right.
widow.
yes.
So it was like widow here.
You
Right there.
realize that British wear wedding ring on the left.
Oh, is it that?
Yes, and I thought that you said that Prince Albert was on the left, which is
Which is the wedding
yeah.
finger.
Yes.
So
And
Which
the
is a
widow
proper,
right.
proper thing.
Prince Albert, John
wear it
Brown.
on the
Prince
left.
Albert, John
But
Brown.
is there a tradition to put the ring on the other hand if you're a widow or widow? No.
Yes, that's
Not-
what I meant.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
I don't
because
know
in
the
Russia
answer to
there
that.
is kind of.
Okay.
I don't know the answer.
Okay.
No, there isn't.
Mhm.
There isn't.
There isn't a tradition. I think she had quite a few other rings on as well. I mean, I think all the stuff that she wanted, you know. Can you imagine saying, in my coffin I want, you know, and there's this list going on. Perhaps
Then
just
it's
do it
made
as an
of
exercise.
Yeah, that explains the size of the coffin.
My grandmother.
A lot of
same,
clutter. She was famous for
She's
surrounding
still
with
alive, but
clutter.
I'm gonna
and-
list.
I think, you know, for your homework, you should go home and make a list of the things you want to have in your coffin.
Any more questions?
I have a question which might seem a bit stupid. When we, or well,
Yeah.
stupid, when we think about the Victorian age, we usually think of it as of an age of propriety, primness, right? Does Queen Victoria herself have anything to do with this? Did she
Yes.
influence the morals?
Yes.
In common,
Yes.
or was she just born into? And if she did, how did she do
I
it?
mean, I think, yes, she did influence people's...
By her own example? Or?
by her own example. I mean, one of the things people forget about her is that she let herself be written about. I mean, she is the first public queen. She appears in the newspapers. She has books published about her. They're all very, very carefully put together.
She also wrote books.
And she also, she wrote books herself, but in them, what comes over is the sanctity of the family. Everything has, you know, that is the most important thing. And everything really derives from that.
I believe Albert also was a great stickler for propriety.
He was very Germanic, shall we say, in his views on that. And one of the great reliefs of being British is to realise that Albert died when he did, because I think we were saved from something that could have been quite difficult constitutionally. I think Albert really saw himself more of a king in a German sense than and even a Russian sense than the consort that he was. I think it was fortunate that he died, because there could well have been quite a difficult constitutional clash. But on your point, I think she did set the standards, and it was set in things like, you know, divorce was barely recognised. You know, men who were philandering were not allowed to come to court, even though her own son was one of them. And she gave him a hard time for it, you know, I mean, really, really hard time. She wasn't prepared to let him, you know, have his, a bit like Prince Charles, really go off and, you know, have his girlfriends and everybody look the other way. She wasn't like that about him.
Oh, but even Prince Charles had problems with that. I mean.
No, that's true. That's true.
And if you compare the Victorian age with the previous time, like the beginning of the 19th century, the 18th century, was it becoming more strict, more rigid, or was it just remaining the same as?
I think I think the late 18th century and the early 19th century have been, certainly the monarchs have been pretty low creatures actually. Their morals had not been what they were noted for, such as the Prince Regent and his various illicit relationships. So the monarchy was in some, I mean, when she came to the throne, the monarchy was in quite a low state of low reputation. One thing that she did, actually because of Albert to begin with, was to raise it from the muckraking monarchy that had been before that and give it this it's the family. This is what Victoria is all about, the family, the royal family, respectable, no questions asked, you know, no naughty behaviour put up with. She created the royal family, and it was, as we know, a vast family.
More questions? no more questions. Let's thank Tony again for his lecture.
Thank you very much.